The wind caught the door and slammed it shut behind her. "For God's sake, someone get that dog away from the steps," the bailiff barked, his voice cutting through the gray morning like a whip. Heads turned, not just toward him but toward the animal, a thin, mottled mutt huddled against the base of the courthouse columns, ribs faintly visible beneath a coat dulled by rain. It didn't flinch at the shouting. It didn't even look up. It just sat there, eyes fixed on something no one else could see. Claire Donovan, assistant to Judge Malcolm Hayes, stopped halfway up the steps, the briefcase in her hand, suddenly feeling heavier. She had passed that dog every morning for 3 days. At first she assumed it belonged to someone inside, maybe a homeless man waiting on a hearing, or one of the street vendors who sometimes parked their carts in the square. But each morning it was alone, same spot, same silent watch. The only change was the weather: rain on Monday, biting wind on Tuesday, and now this brittle cold that turned breath to mist before it reached the ground. The bailiff moved toward it, boots striking the marble with impatient thuds, but the dog didn't move, not forward, not away, just sat. Claire felt something in her chest shift, a small, unwanted ache, and she hurried past before the bailiff could glance at her, before she could get pulled into a conversation about strays and animal control. Inside the courthouse was its own kind of cold, the kind that seeped from the walls, no matter how high the radiators hissed. The day's docket was full: a property dispute, 2 assault charges, a custody hearing that promised to get ugly. But her mind kept sliding back to the dog outside. She could still see the way its tail didn't so much as twitch when people passed. Still see how its paws were pressed so tight against each other it almost looked like it was holding itself together. By mid-morning she found herself staring out the second-floor window during a recess. The dog was still there. Someone had left a paper cup of water near its feet, but the surface hadn't even rippled. A man in a navy suit paused to look down at it, shook his head, and walked on. "Claire," Judge Hayes' voice startled her, "we're back in session. Don't let me find you daydreaming in my courtroom." The judge was not unkind, but he had the sort of presence that made the air feel thinner when he was displeased. She followed him back into the chamber, shaking off the image like it was just a distraction, one more detail in a city full of small heartbreaks. But when the doors closed behind her, she could still hear, faintly, the wind outside scraping along the stone steps. The custody hearing began. A young mother in a frayed cardigan sat on one side of the room, her hands clenched in her lap. Across from her, a man in an oil-stained jacket sat rigid, his lawyer whispering into his ear. Voices rose, cracked, broke. Allegations flew: neglect, abandonment, betrayal, words that could twist the air until it hurt to breathe. Claire wrote notes as quickly as she could, but the rhythm of the words faltered when she noticed the judge looking past the attorneys, his gaze shifting toward the high windows. It was brief, only a flicker, but she'd known him long enough to see when something snagged at his thoughts. The day crawled forward, hearings blurred together, papers stacked higher. The rain started just before noon, thin needles against the glass, and still, that dog stayed put. By the time the final recess came, Claire couldn't stop herself. She slipped her coat on, mumbled something about needing air, and stepped outside. The wind had teeth now, and the rain had turned to the kind that slid beneath collars and cuffs before you realized it. The dog was wet through, but it didn't shake itself off. Its head lifted when she approached, and for the first time, she saw its eyes clearly. They weren't dull, they weren't even pleading, they were waiting. "Hey," she whispered, crouching a few feet away. The mutt's ears twitched. Its gaze didn't leave hers. She glanced over her shoulder. The bailiff wasn't around. She took a slow step forward, then another. The dog didn't back away. Claire held out her hand. Not to touch, just to offer something human in the wet and the cold. She half expected the dog to sniff it, maybe turn away. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, almost like a nod, and then shifted just enough for her to see what was tucked beneath its chest. A frayed length of leather collar, snapped clean. At one end, her throat tightened. This wasn't just a stray, this was a dog that had lost something. Someone, and wasn't leaving without them. A voice cut through the rain. "Miss Donovan." The bailiff stood at the door, waving her back. She straightened, took one last look at the dog, and went inside. The afternoon wore on. Papers passed between hands. Verdicts were read. And then, just as they were wrapping up, Judge Hayes removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and said, almost to himself, "That dog's been out there long enough." Claire's pen froze over the page. "Bailiff," the judge said, his tone firm now. "Bring it in." The courtroom went still. Somewhere outside, the rain softened, and on the steps, the dog lifted its head. The bailiff hesitated at first, glancing at the judge as if to confirm he'd heard correctly. Judge Hayes didn't repeat himself. He simply set his glasses on the bench and waited. The low murmur of the courtroom shifted into a thick silence, the kind where even the scrape of a chair leg feels too loud. Claire's pulse picked up. She couldn't remember the last time a case had been interrupted for something that wasn't written into the docket. When the doors opened again, the cold followed in wet air, carrying the faint scent of rain and stone. The bailiff appeared with the dog at his side, though at his side wasn't quite right. The mutt moved on its own, head high, eyes sweeping the room like it was searching for someone. Water darkened the marble where its paws touched, leaving a trail from the entrance toward the bench. People turned in their seats. A defense attorney cleared his throat. One of the stenographers frowned, her fingers paused above the keys. The judge, however, didn't seem to notice the ripples of unease. His eyes stayed fixed on the dog as it came to a stop in the middle of the chamber, rain still dripping from the tip of its tail. "Ms. Donovan," Hayes said, his voice low but carrying, "bring me that collar." Claire felt every gaze in the room shift toward her. She rose, her heels clicking softly against the floor, and crouched in front of the animal. Up close, she could see that the leather was worn smooth in places, the kind of wear that only came from years of constant touch. She eased the broken strap from beneath its chest, the dog watching her with an expression that was neither trust nor fear but something in between, like it had learned long ago to expect both in equal measure. She placed the collar in the judge's hand. He turned it over, his thumb tracing the jagged tear at one end. Then he read the small brass plate attached to it. The name was simple, etched deep, Murphy. The name landed like a stone in the quiet. Hayes's eyes narrowed, not in anger but in thought, his gaze growing distant as if it had found a path into the past. Claire recognized that look. She'd seen it when a case suddenly connected to something personal for him, a file that stirred an old memory. Bailiff Hayes said after a moment, "Check the docket from 3 days ago. Look for the Harper case." Claire's mind was already piecing it together. Harper, she remembered the name scrawled across a custody dispute. A man who had left the courthouse without speaking to anyone after the ruling. No one had seen him linger outside. No one had asked where he went. The bailiff returned minutes later, a thin manila folder in hand. "Yes, Your Honor, Marcus Harper. He didn't contest the property division. Left before we could give him the order for personal effects, and his address." "It's the bailiff," paused, glancing at the dog. "It's 3 blocks from here, sir." A stir went through the gallery. Claire glanced down at Murphy, whose eyes hadn't left the judge. She didn't know why, but the air in the room felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were waiting for the next line. Hayes closed the folder. "This dog has been sitting outside my courthouse for 3 days, in the rain, in the cold. That tells me it belongs to someone who either can't or won't come looking for it." There was a pause then, long enough for Claire to hear the faint ticking of the old clock above the exit. The judge leaned forward slightly. "We're going to find out which it is." The bailiff moved to take the dog by the collar, but Murphy stepped forward before he could be touched, heading straight for the wide double doors as if he'd understood every word. Claire caught herself holding her breath. This was no ordinary stray. It knew where it was going. Outside, the rain had slowed to a mist, blurring the edges of the courthouse square. Murphy led them down the steps across the street and into a narrow lane that smelled faintly of wet concrete and cigarette smoke. The bailiff followed with clipped strides. Claire walked a few paces back, her notebook still in hand though she wasn't writing. They stopped at a peeling green door. Murphy sat. The judge, who had come along despite the cold, knocked once firmly. There was no answer. He knocked again, harder this time. From inside came the faint scrape of movement, hesitant, dragging. The door opened just enough to reveal a sliver of a man, his eyes bloodshot, his skin pale under several days' worth of stubble. Marcus Harper. His gaze dropped immediately to the dog. Murphy rose, tail low but wagging once, then again, faster, until it was a blur. Harper's mouth trembled, but no sound came out. "This your dog?" Hayes asked. The man's hand gripped the doorframe. She was my wife's," he said finally, voice breaking on the last word. Claire felt the world tilt, just slightly, a detail slipping into place that explained everything and nothing at once. The mid-afternoon light caught in Murphy's wet fur, turning it almost gold. The judge didn't speak again, but his eyes softened, the edge of formality falling away. Whatever this was, it was no longer just about a lost dog. It was about something left unresolved and the unshakable loyalty of an animal who refused to move until someone put it right. The heavy oak doors closed behind them, sealing the rain and street noise outside. For a moment, the entire courtroom seemed to breathe differently. Every head turned, as if some unspoken current had swept through the room. The bailiff led the dog down the center aisle, his broad frame stiff with the awareness that all eyes were on him. The animal's paws left faint prints on the polished floor, each step measured, almost deliberate, as though it knew this place demanded a certain gravity. Claire watched from her desk, heart thudding harder than she could explain. Up close, the dog looked even thinner, its coat darkened from wet, small drops still sliding from its fur onto the floor. Yet there was nothing skittish about it. Its eyes, steady, fixed on the judge's bench, made the air feel taut. "Judge." Hayes leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the desk. "Well," he said, his voice quieter than usual but carrying easily through the space. "It seems you've been waiting a while." The dog didn't move, didn't look away. Something passed between them, not the indulgent smile people gave strays, but a more searching, unsettled recognition. The moment fractured when the sound of a woman's gasp cut across the room. In the third row, near the wall, a middle-aged woman had risen to her feet, one hand pressed against her mouth. Claire noticed her eyes shining, her knuckles white against the back of the pew. That's Daisy," the woman whispered, her voice cracking. The murmur that followed swelled like water in a narrow channel. The judge's gaze flicked toward her. "You know this dog?" The woman's head bobbed in quick, almost frantic nods. "She's mine. Or she was, I thought." Her breath hitched. "I thought she was gone for good. She ran off the night." She stopped herself, swallowing the rest. The silence afterward was sharp enough to hurt. Claire's fingers tightened around her pen. The weight in the woman's voice wasn't just grief, it was fear, maybe even guilt. The dog's ears had perked at the sound, but it didn't move toward her. It stayed rooted, still facing the bench, as if something else kept it there. Judge Hayes leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly. "The night what?" The woman hesitated, twisting the strap of her handbag until it creaked. "The night the police came," she said finally, her voice low, almost swallowed by the room. "It was a fight, my son." He shook her head. "I was told to stay away from the courthouse. I didn't think she'd—" Her voice broke again. The air grew heavier. Claire felt the thread of the story pulling tighter, but something still didn't fit. Why would the dog sit here for days? Not at the woman's home, not searching the streets. The judge glanced toward the bailiff, then back to the dog. "Bring her closer," he said. The bailiff hesitated but obeyed. Guiding the dog toward the front, it walked with quiet certainty, nails clicking against the wood, until it stood just a few feet from the bench. The woman's hand trembled as she reached out slightly, but the dog didn't turn her way. Instead, it lifted its head toward the judge again, tail giving one slow, deliberate wag. The judge's voice softened. "She's not here for you, is she?" he asked. Not to the woman, but to the dog, as if the answer might be in the stillness. Between them, the woman's eyes widened, hurt flickering across her face. "I don't understand." Claire's pulse quickened. She remembered the custody hearing earlier that week, the one where the defendant's voice had cracked, describing the dog that never came home. She remembered the way Judge Hayes had paused at the window that day, looking down at the steps. And then it clicked, not in words, but in the shift of the judge's expression. The dog wasn't waiting for its owner. It was waiting for someone else entirely, someone inside this very room. The hush that fell over the courtroom when the dog entered was unlike any silence that space had ever known. No gavel strike, no shouted objection. Not even the weight of a guilty verdict could still a room in quite that way. The bailiff guided the mutt gently through the side door, the leash a borrowed length of nylon cord that looked out of place against its weathered fur. Water still clung to the dog's coat, dripping in quiet rhythm onto the polished floor, each drop strangely loud in the air. Judge Hayes watched as the animal paused at the threshold, its gaze sweeping the room like it was searching for a face. Claire felt her pulse in her throat. It wasn't just the sight of it here, in the solemn heart of the courthouse. It was the strange certainty that the dog knew exactly why it had been called inside. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Let it move," he told the bailiff. The man hesitated. Protocol didn't exactly cover canines in the chamber, but then loosened the slack. The mutt stepped forward, slow but deliberate, its nails ticking against the floor, its eyes scanning the rows. It passed the defense table without pause, then the prosecution, moving like it was following an invisible thread only it could sense. When it reached the gallery, a murmur rose from the benches. A woman in a gray raincoat stiffened, her hands clutching the strap of her purse until her knuckles paled. Claire saw it happen. The dog stopped, head tilting slightly, eyes fixed on her. The woman's lips trembled, not in fear but in something far stranger, recognition. The judge's voice broke the moment. "Ma'am, would you step forward?" The woman didn't move at first. Then, as if propelled by some force outside her will, she stood and walked toward the dog. The mutt's tail gave a single, cautious wag. It wasn't the joyous, leaping reunion Claire had imagined. No barking, no bounding into arms. It was quieter, heavier. The woman knelt, her knees creaking against the floor, and reached out. Her fingers brushed the damp fur, and the dog leaned into the touch like it had been holding itself upright for days and could finally let go. A faint sound escaped her, half sob, half exhale, and she looked up at the judge. This is Max," she said. "My brother's dog." The room leaned in on those words. The judge didn't speak, but Claire saw the calculation in his eyes, the way each piece of this puzzle began to shift in his mind. The woman explained, her voice halting at first, then gathering momentum. Her brother had been arrested the previous week on charges tied to a property dispute that had spiraled into violence. He hadn't been allowed to call anyone about the dog before he was taken in. The family had assumed Max was at home or in the pound, not waiting outside the courthouse in the cold and rain. But what caught Claire, and she suspected the judge, was the part she said next. "He's been here every day since then." She looked at the bailiff, then at Claire, as if they could confirm it. Judge Hayes folded his hands. "Every morning, every evening," he said quietly. "Hasn't moved from those steps." The dog didn't break eye contact with the woman. It was as if he understood every word. The judge glanced at Claire, and something unspoken passed between them. The story wasn't just about a stray anymore. This was about loyalty that didn't bend, even when the human world tore itself apart in courtrooms and custody battles. And maybe, beneath the surface, it was about something else entirely. The reminder that not everything could be reasoned into submission. Then came the twist Claire hadn't seen coming. The judge turned to the bailiff. "Bring in the defendant." From holding, a ripple of shock moved through the room. The woman froze, her hand still on the dog's neck. The bailiff hesitated, then disappeared through the side door. Moments later, he returned with a man in orange prison scrubs, wrists cuffed, eyes scanning the chamber in confusion. The dog's head whipped around the moment the man entered. The stillness shattered, tail wagging now, low whines escaping its throat. The man stopped dead, the color draining from his face. "Max," he said, his voice breaking on the name, and in that instant, everything shifted. The courtroom, the case, the hard lines between guilt and innocence, they all felt different. Max strained against the leash, and the bailiff, looking more human than official now, let it slip from his fingers. The dog crossed the space in seconds, pressing himself against the man's knees, tail thudding like a heartbeat. The defendant's shackled hands bent awkwardly to reach him, fingers curling into damp fur. For a moment, the rain, the charges, the cold marble walls, all of it fell away. There was only this, a man, a dog, and the days they had been apart. Claire stood frozen, the weight of the moment pressing into her chest. She didn't know what the judge would do next, but she knew one thing. Whatever happened now, no one in that room would forget the day Max walked into the courthouse. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even Judge Hayes, usually a fortress of procedure, let the silence linger longer than protocol allowed. The defendant's hand stayed on Max's shoulders, his forehead lowered until it touched the dog's head. For 3 days, Max had waited in the cold without food or shelter, never knowing if the person he was waiting for would walk through those doors. And yet, he had not moved. That kind of devotion, Claire thought, didn't need translation. It spoke louder than any testimony that had been heard in that courtroom. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was low but steady. "Mr. Donovan, whatever else the law decides, you won't lose this dog." It wasn't a ruling written into the docket, but it landed heavier than any sentence. The bailiff took a half step forward, as if to remind the room of the rules, but stopped when Hayes raised a hand. This wasn't about bending the law. It was about recognizing the one thing still unbroken in a life that had been unraveling. The woman in the gray raincoat was crying openly now, though she tried to hide it behind her sleeve. Max stayed pressed to his owner's side, his tail moving in slow, tired arcs. It wasn't the frantic joy of a pet seeing its person after a day apart. It was something quieter, deeper, a promise kept on both sides. When they led the man back to ward holding, Max followed until the bailiff gently guided him to the woman. She knelt and wrapped her arms around him, whispering something only he could hear. The judge adjourned court, with a soft rap of the gavel, and the crowd began to file out. But the image stayed, a loyal dog who refused to leave. A family piecing itself together in the smallest of ways. As Claire stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The steps where Max had sat for days were empty now, but in her mind, they would never be. She thought of the cold mornings, the stillness, the way those eyes had never stopped searching. And she realized the truth sometimes, in a place built on judgments, the purest kind of justice came not from the bench, but from the heart of a dog who simply waited.